Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back. Today I am joined by a brand new guest. I'm chatting with Katie from I Hope You Suffer, and we are going to be talking about Rose Red, which is a 2002 miniseries that aired on ABC back in the day, and it's certainly something. So we have quite a bit to discuss here. But Katie, before we dive in, do you want to let the listeners know a little bit more about yourself?
As you said, my name is Katie. I have been a Stephen King fan since before I even knew who Stephen King was. So I'm very, very excited to be talking to somebody just about Stephen King, basically. I co-host a podcast called I Hope You Suffer. And we typically kind of focus on movies that are either like lesser known or sort of known for being bad. So, needless to say, we've done a lot of King adaptations. We usually just do like 1 month. Usually, I think it's March. We do just all Stephen King that month. So yeah.
Yeah, there are plenty of bad adaptations to go around when it comes to Stephen King's works being adapted. And I think with Rose Red, because of the fact that it's this original screenplay, and there are some things that you kind of catch here and there with Stephen King stuff where you're like, oh, okay, I see how he's tying this back to some of his other stuff. But because this takes place in Seattle, it feels very far removed from the rest of Stephen King's universe because we're so used to his characters being in Maine or even Colorado for a handful of, big stories that he's told. But I think with Rose Red, what was interesting to me was the fact that you could tell what some of his influences are right off the bat, because as someone who grew up in California, I had visited the Winchester Mystery House, and this
Hmm.
haunted house is very much along those lines, but it has that psychic twist to it, and the house sort of comes alive and changes all the time. But the whole construction 24/7 thing was like straight from the Winchester house. And I was like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here, Stephen King.
Yeah, when the movie started out, so I guess a little background on me with specifically Rose Red. I actually remember watching this on ABC when it aired. And it was like one of the first things that I sort of watched like as it was coming out, as opposed to like super, super later, like with The Shining and all that kind of thing. And so it's been a long time since I've watched it. But when it started out and it said Seattle, I was like, well, that's sort of weird. Like, I wasn't really sure. And then I even watched like the making of to try and figure out like why he chose to just like base it in Seattle. And so that felt like kind of a weird, because we don't even have any, like normally, even if it's somewhere else, he's got that like quintessential character that has like, like the little main draw to their voice.
Yeah.
And you don't have that at all in this one. But I kind of appreciate it because it's like, it is, so you mentioned the Winchester Mystery House, which I've been a fan of paranormal stuff like that my entire life. So the fact that he took this and then like very obviously influences from Haunting of Hill House, which I am just like obsessed with any iteration of that story, and then sort of like combined it and then added all of his little like, we've got a child who has powers and is not very understood. And then you have like the one character who has like mommy issues, to say the least. So for me, the reason that this is so special is because it does have like those outside factors that I already really like, but he just inserts so much, even with just like, he does this thing where he adds like the little nods to like past stories and things like that. So even though this might not be like the best movie, I think all of those things kind of make it like, if you're just like a deep Stephen King fan, definitely make it worth the watch.
Yeah, I went into this not really knowing how it was going to be because all I knew about it was that it came out on DVD. The DVD was now like $50 on Amazon. And
Yeah.
it's one that's harder to find, which it's always interesting to me what adaptations and what original screenplays that happens with, because like you can easily buy the golden years in a collection, and that
Hmm.
is not nearly as good as this, to say the least. But with Rose Red, I was like, you have so many bigger names in this cast, and maybe they weren't as big at the time, but you have Nancy Travis, who has had a pretty long career from what I can tell, and she's currently on whatever that Tim Allen show is, Last Man Standing or something like that. You have
Yeah.
Melanie Linsky, who has gone on to do many other things. She was also in the first season of Castle Rock, so she's someone who ends up coming back to the Stephen King world. And then you just have these sort of character actors who have been in a bunch of things like Julian Sands, Kevin Teague. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then you have a young Emily Deschanel. And you just recognize so many of these people, especially now going back and watching it because I had never seen it before. And I was like, oh, there's Jimmy Simpson just popping up in this. And, it's really fun when you get to see that. And maybe, like I said at the time, these cast members weren't as well known as they are now, but I still think it was a solid enough cast to get quite a bit of attention. And the funny thing is, this was actually supposed to be something that King worked on with Steven Spielberg as a movie, and they were going to have like a $40 million budget, and it was going to be this whole thing. But King went through and did, I think, 3 or 4 drafts of the script, and Steven Spielberg kept wanting to change things. And so they kind of went their separate ways, and it took a while for this to get made. So I think, given the time period and given the cast, the fact that it even came out seems like it was a miracle at that point.
Yeah, I read a little bit about sort of like the making of, and I feel like another thing that makes this just like such a Stephen King thing is it has like a crazy story behind it where so it was supposed to be a movie, and he, I guess then the actual The Haunting came out, which is, like a remake of Haunting of Hill House. So he was kind of like, oh, well, I guess I'm not going to do a movie. Let's do this like miniseries, which I think he just loves miniseries anyway. But when he was writing it, I guess he finished writing the script for this, and then that's when he had his sort of like famous car accident. So then it was like everything put on pause. So you're right. It's just like one of those things that from the beginning, I feel like they just had to struggle, and they just like kept going through it. And I sort of wonder, like, I know the budget, it aired on TV as a miniseries, so the budget's like not going to be as big as a movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I sort of wonder, like, what it would have been as a movie with like the budget, because the one thing I will say about this miniseries is that, like, when I originally watched it, I don't remember the graphics being great at the time for 2002. So now that we're in like 2020, the CG aspect of it, I think, is pretty bad
Yeah.
in a lot of places, and I think sort of takes away from anything that would be scary. But they're like practical effects and the puppetry that they used for some of the characters is still like practical effects in movies and whatever are my favorite.
Yes.
So I think that they still held up so well. And one of the things that I remember about this miniseries is how freaky the like ghost jerky people look. And I just wonder if they had had a bigger budget, could they have done those like instances of practical effects if they could have done it like on a bigger scale? Because, they blew most of their budget on the set, which
Right.
was gorgeous. Like,
Uh-huh.
I think they spent money where they needed to, but I don't know, those graphics.
Especially when you get all of the bees going around and you're like, yeah, that doesn't look too great. It was a little more forgivable when you had like the faces coming out of the fire because
Hmm.
it wasn't as cut and dry between this is CGI and these are the people. It's like, okay, the flames coming out, that looked a little bit better than these like CGI bees floating around someone's head. And you really get a sense that they did want this set to just blow people away because the outside is Thornwood Castle, which is up in the Tacoma area. So they basically made this take place in the Washington state area because of the fact that that castle did already physically exist there. And then they did the interior set design in airplane hangars. So they
Hmm.
had these big, massive spaces, obviously, and you really get a sense of that grandiosity with the set and the house and the fact that you know, they go into a room and then they come back out and the house has changed. And there was so much going into just those design pieces, especially that library too with the mirror floor. I was
Oh
like,
man,
oh my
yeah.
goodness, I want that library without that floor.
Yeah, I think the man, the house is like such a, obviously the house is like one of the major characters in the miniseries, and I think they did such a good job. Even early on when they're going through and like doing the tour, I mean, you don't really get as many. It's really hard for me to not compare this to The Haunting because it came out a little bit before, and it's like the same premise where I don't know. There's just like crazy houses, but that was a movie. They had a bigger budget. So you have like a few key rooms that they have, like the perspective room, the mirror library, like you said, the office where like everything is upside down. And
Hmm.
it's all just so cool. I don't know. I still feel like the work that they put into it, even for now, was like super impressive. And it's actually even like more impressive than I remember it being.
Yeah, there's so much going on in every single room, too. It was one of those things where, because the quality wasn't super great, it's not like this super well colored HD show. And I was like, am I missing things in the background here? Because I know that Easter eggs are a big part of Stephen King adaptations too. And when you have people who are making them, it's sort of just this thing, and then we get that Stephen King cameo and we're like, okay, this is a Stephen King TV miniseries for sure. And he has appeared in, I want to say, a good majority of the adaptations that I've seen, especially ones he's been involved with on such a high level like this one. And it's so fun when you get those little moments and you catch them. But there was so much going on with the set design in this. I was like, I don't know if I'm missing something. And you have to keep track of things too, because things are changing so rapidly in this. But I think overall, the cast and the characters worked well. And story wise, it might have had a little too much going on, I think, just because of how distracted you could get with the set design. And you have all of these different characters coming from very different places and coming together, and you're kind of trying to get the story on each of them.
Hmm.
And at times, it just feels like they're throwing way too much at you. It's almost like if they were to do this in 2020, I could see it being like an 8 episode miniseries.
Right. I agree with you. And especially because we have like a pretty big like main cast of, all the psychics and the
Mm-hmm.
professor and Steven Rimbauer who like come to the house. But then you have like all the ghosts too, and like trying to follow everybody's storyline does get kind of bogged down because like people are constantly popping out. Some are ghosts, some are, I don't know, corpse like zombies essentially. And I feel like the one thing that didn't work for me in this, like rewatching it now, is that I feel like towards the end, he sort of gave up on tying up all the loose ends of the characters and was kind of just going more for like a scare because there's like the one character who was like an actress and like I don't really understand why they needed to put her in it so much when she just was like someone who went missing. And I wish they would have focused more on, like the actual family because they pop up. Obviously, Ellen is a big part of it, but like April pops up, her daughter, just like really randomly for I don't know. I just felt like
Yeah.
the story wasn't explained very well, like even through the end. So I think you're right. I think it's hard because, and then you have all these people who are running around and sometimes they pop up and you're like, is this person dead or are they alive? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so like people, so yeah, it was kind of a lot, especially for something that's so long. It was like over 4 hours, right?
It was somewhere around there. I think it was 3 parts, and without commercials, each part was about an hour and 20 minutes. So it came in right around 4 hours or something like that. And, like I said, maybe something like an 8 episode miniseries today would work because you could explore these characters' backgrounds a little more. And I found myself getting very confused as to which Rimbauer was haunting them at any given time because, like you said, the mom is there, the daughter shows up at some point, and it's all very confusing. And I feel like it might be confusing on purpose, but there's this sense that there's so much more going on with this family. And then there's obviously this connection to Annie, but you don't really fully understand what it is. I don't want to sound too negative about this because I really did like a lot of it, and I'm a sucker for a good haunted house story, and they definitely nailed the haunted house part of this story. It's just because of how many characters there are, you really get this feeling of confusion on a different level because you're like, okay, wait, this one has this particular psychic ability, this one has this other psychic ability, and it's like she got a bunch of people who could do different things because she needed all of those abilities for whatever reason. And then you see the professor and she just becomes immensely unlikable as
Yeah.
the show goes on. And you have some characters who are unlikable from the start, you just have so many different personalities coming together in this story that when you have a character like Joyce and she is really assertive and Steve sort of starts feeling used by the end of it, but then you also have a character like Emery who just has the most punchable face in the world in this. It's just one of those things where you're like, oh my goodness, why would she ever contact this guy? And I'm not really sure what he contributed. All he could do was make ghosts go away.
Yeah, I feel like I in the beginning I was like writing down all their different powers or whatever, and I felt like it had the potential to be very cool because when we're introduced to him, you got to have the person in the story who's like a man child and who's like very unlikable. So you have him, and I think he did. You're right. He had a very punchable face. I think he, for me, was like the best in the miniseries just because he played his character so well. But you get the scene where he's like going in the fridge to get ice cream, and there's just like all this blood and gore in his fridge, and he's just kind of like, the idea that he is like living with the ghosts or whatever's happening to him just happen all the time, and he's sort of just like, okay, whatever, yeah. To me sounds like really terrifying. I don't know that I would get used to it, but he sort of is like, worn down by that. And so I felt like his powers could have been so much cooler because he's like a postcog, right? And he's going into a house where all of this crazy stuff happens. But then once he actually gets to the house, it's like he sees things that scare him, but they don't really have anything to do with the story. And I feel like that happens with a lot of the characters. Like Pam, pretty much useless, right? Except for that she's used to sort of like lure out other people. So I don't know. I guess maybe I focus too much on their powers instead of like, I think maybe it's supposed to be more about the relationship of all of them. But I don't know. It just felt like it wasn't developed as much as I would have liked because you're right. I don't understand what Annie had to do with the house. Like it called to her
Yeah.
to come, so I don't really know. And then the ending was a little confusing too as far as like Annie goes, so I don't know.
I was almost waiting for the punch to come where they were like, oh, Annie's actually a Rimbauer, like this distant relative, and the house wants her power. Because that was the only thing to me that really made sense because we saw how Steve's power, which he didn't really have outside of the house, was amplified tenfold at least. And you have Nick who points that out. It's like, Steve's powers might not be all that strong on the outside, but here, because he's a Rimbauer, he has some sort of amplification of his abilities that you otherwise wouldn't have known about.
Yeah, they I don't know. They almost could have even had, well, because um you know Ellen, they also had a son. Like Annie could have been, the son like went off to boarding school and we never hear from them again, so like Annie could have been part of that. But I don't know. It's just she, she is I mean, he has a lot of stories where, there's like children who are like the most powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he just sort of, wanted to have his like, his quintessential character in her.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, there's like really no reason. And then, when she gets there, she kind of wants to be friends with April, like the little girl ghost, and she's trying to like lure her away. And then all of a sudden, she just decides that she doesn't want that anymore. So, like, I'm not really sure why though. And that's one of the major, like, aside from them not wrapping up the other characters, this was like the key plot to me that was the misstep because, you go from, oh my gosh, everyone's stuck in the house, we can't get out, to she just decides she's done. And so I'm not really sure like how they came to that. There's so much going on, and like you said earlier, you're just like paying attention to the explosions, and the house is doing crazy stuff towards the end. Like so much stuff happens that I don't know, maybe they thought people wouldn't notice, or maybe I missed something. I don't know.
Sometimes I feel that way too because I watched the first two parts one night and finished up the third part the following day because when you have things like this where it's a 2 or 3 part miniseries and, when they originally aired, they were 2 hours each, it can feel like a lot is being thrown at you at once. And because of the large number of characters in this, it wasn't even that the story was overly complicated. It actually feels like they made it a little too simple. So then there were some plot holes, and you were like, okay, but what about this?
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm trying to remember when I originally watched it, I feel like when it was broken down into those separate nights with like all the commercials and all that stuff, I didn't know. I mean, I was a lot younger. I was like 15, so I probably didn't even realize that there was any plot points. I probably just was like scared by the ghosts and like all that kind of thing. One of the things I think that maybe didn't lend itself to Rose Red is, they were airing it on ABC. So they did that like mockumentary, which I don't know if you've seen it, but it's basically just like kind of like an episode of like Unsolved Mysteries or something where they kind of just like make it seem like Rose Red was a real house.
Okay.
And so it's actually pretty cool. It's on the DVD I mean, DVD is hard to get a hold of.
Yeah.
So at the time they had like the mockumentary, like they just put so much into advertising it that and then you have, they had, which I didn't even realize until I looked it up recently, that Stephen King did not write, they did like a version of Ellen Rimbauer's diary that you can read through.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even realize that he didn't write it. And they did that on purpose, but I actually just ordered it so that I can read it. But they just like did all this like promotion and hype. And so then I feel like when people watched it, it sort of just because of the weak, I don't know, story or whatever you want to say, like it just didn't hold up to it. And I feel like that's probably one of the reasons that this one kind of fell to the wayside. And I mean, it's extremely like late 90s, early 2000s also, which I feel like at the time gave us some not really great movies.
Yeah, when I got to the 2000s, I was looking and I was like, oh, here come the TV shows and the TV miniseries.
Yeah. I don't really know how. I think it's really hard because a lot of his like really beloved stories came out, like in the 80s. So I feel like this was not, I mean, on the documentary for this, they talk about Storm of the Century a lot, which I remember there being a lot of hype around too, but I also feel like I feel like the only miniseries that people like super love without them redoing it or whatever is it. But the thing that's special to me about this one is that it's just like he wrote it as a miniseries and it's just that, it's not like written from a book where you can go and read the book and appreciate that differently. So it is kind of like you just have to take it for what it is. So in some aspects, I think makes it sort of a little different than like most of his stuff.
Yeah, I think with his original screenplays too, in particular, because you don't have that source material that you're working off of and writing a script is very different from writing a novel, he's used to being so immensely descriptive in his novels. And I don't know if you've happened to have read any of the scripts he's done, but I have the script book for Storm of the Century, and it is super dense for being a script. So even with his scripts, he's writing these lengthy paragraphs to describe certain set pieces or scenes, and you really get a sense that this one had to be probably equally as descriptive as Storm of the Century, if not more so, just because of how much was going on in it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny though. I feel like he's like, well, I'm not, you know, writing a book, but essentially I'm still gonna write a book because they're so
Yeah,
long. And I actually felt like the acting and the dialogue, like one of the things that I like about King's writing the most is like reading his dialogue between people because it just always feels there's just like something about it. There's just like something real about it. And I felt like the dialogue in this movie was really good. The only person that didn't work for me at all was Nick. I don't know why, but every time
interesting.
he talked, it just sounded weird. I don't know what it was, but everyone else I felt like their dialogue was fine. And then he would say things that I felt like maybe they were trying to make him sound scholarly. Like I don't really know how to explain it, but he did not work for me.
That's interesting. I wonder if it's because he was the foreigner in the group, basically.
Right.
He
Hmm.
sort of had this different thought process than everyone else because he maybe had this different education. And like you said, he always had to sound scholarly. But at times, he was also the one with the most common sense. You know, you had Emery who just wanted to kill Annie the entire time. And Nick was like, no. And what I liked about Nick was how he pushed Annie gently to get her powers to do something that would benefit the entire group. Like when the hallway was suddenly blocked off and the piece of rope was just in the middle of the wall, and he was able to get her to hone her powers and just, push that wall away so they could retrace their steps again. It was something where you can tell that, at least with Nick and Steve, they cared about Annie way more than any of the other ones who were strangers to her. Obviously, her sister cared a ton about her, but
Right.
you really get this feeling that they were kind of the fatherly presence that she never gets at home.
Hmm.
And I think that's where Nick's character maybe worked a little better. And then obviously that role became more and more a part of Steve's character as the miniseries went on.
Yeah. I I'm trying to just I don't know why it didn't work for me. Like there's like one scene where they've spent the first night and Annie is out in the health room, the solarium, and she's, like playing with her dice. And Steve comes in or somebody comes in and says to Nick, "Oh, is that Annie out there?" And he said, "Annie it is." And I was like, people don't talk like that, but
Yeah, I believe that was between Steve and Nick, and I didn't even really catch on to it that much. And it's one of those things where you're just kind of like, I don't really know why you're writing a character this way. And at times it worked for me, at times it
yeah.
didn't. But at the same time, you're kind of like, did you do this just because he was the foreigner in the group? And you're kind of like, I don't know how well that particular role aged because one thing I've noticed is that obviously some of the language used in Stephen King's books is highly unacceptable now, but at the time, he was basically writing things for the time. And
Right.
especially when he goes back in time, like with Shawshank Redemption, and he's writing about a whole different decade, same with The Green Mile, you're going to use language that reflects those time periods. So with this, it was kind of like, okay, I think this is technically supposed to be taking place in 2002. I think he wrote it to be the present day, essentially. And it just felt a little off. And luckily, his writing has progressed to, reflect the times. And he's writing more diverse characters. And he is not using the same language he used before, which, if he hadn't made those changes, I don't think I would have been as interested in doing this podcast in the first place.
Oh yeah, some of his older stuff and some of even the movies is just I mean like yeah, obviously you totally understand, but some of it's like really hard to get through.
Yeah, yeah. I think Thinner was one of those for me where it was just like, this does not
Oh man.
feel great at all.
No, Thinner we actually covered on our podcast and we had to put a in the beginning we were just like, listen, we're gonna use some words that aren't great, but you know, it's not us saying that they're okay to say. But yeah, and I think you know, I don't know if it's different for the way that they're like speaking in this just because it was on ABC and it was on TV. I feel like they they don't, you know, like he always has characters who are, you know, like saying really derogatory things, saying slurs, saying, you know, like highly suggestive, borderline, really gross and sleazy things to each other. And you don't really have that in this one. So for me, I guess reflecting on that, the characters sort of, there's not really like there's obviously conflict between them, especially towards the end, because you know, like a lot of them have actually a lot of them survived. I was really surprised by the amount of people who survive
Yeah.
Rose Red. But towards the end, it's like the really only the strife is that like they want to leave and they can't. So some of them feel like they need to do something bad to Annie. But between each other, you know, you can tell who kind of favors each other and who people don't like. Mostly it's just Emery that nobody likes and he doesn't like anybody else. But aside from that, there's like not really that much strife between them because
Except at the end with Nancy when she's just so.
oh, she just takes a dive off the deep end.
Exactly. And she's just so engrossed with what she wants and what she wants to get out of the house. And there's sort of this excitement when they get there, at least for Nancy, that fades throughout the entire miniseries once you get inside the house. And you just see the house kind of turning her into this different person. And it's almost like how the Overlook works in The Shining.
hmm Yeah, the thing that one of the scenes speaking to that that stood out to me was one of the things that bothered me just as a preface is that like they she went there to record hard data. Like the whole point of that was to get data so that she could kind of give credit to parapsychology. But a lot of the stuff that happens, they like barely record like you know sometimes Steve would like turn on a camera but they don't really do a lot of actual recording with
Yeah.
any of the equipment. But there is this one scene where Nancy is in one of the rooms and there's like, you know, whispering. There's always whispering, a ton of whispering going around. And she's like holding up a mic and she's like listening to it. And she's sort of like the room is like spinning around and she's just like smiling. And she's like so happy that she's like recording this whispering. And in my mind, I was like, that would be so terrifying. I would not be having like a Sound of Music moment to this, which she was clearly having. But yeah, I don't understand. You know, she was getting all of the evidence that she wanted, and then you know when they're like, "Hey, we have to leave," she's really aggressive about not leaving. But as soon as she's left alone, she just sort of like snaps out of it and is like, this was very much a mistake. But so I don't know that part of her sort of getting scared and like not wanting to, you know, for lack of a better term, be part of the house was kind of confusing to me. Like everybody at the end, well, pretty much just her and Annie who sort of like snap out of it. I still don't really understand why that happened. And for me, I think if Nancy would have just stayed sort of like elated to be experiencing the house, I think would have worked better.
It was a very strange dynamic between the professor and Annie because at first you get a sense that Joyce is excited about Annie's abilities and what everyone is going to bring to the table, and then it just turns into something much darker, and we see that she ends up being stuck there because she wanted to be selfish and wanted to do everything in favor of her goal and not with any real regard to anyone's life, because you see that Victor dies, and really Victor dies because Emery is an idiot.
Yeah.
And you see that Pam, who is played by Emily Deschanel, she kind of just disappears and then she's dead and then that's that. And you don't really get anything out of it other than that. But you also have Kathy, who is the one getting Annie to snap out of it. You know, she's doing her writing thing, and then Annie's writing the same words, and then the doors open and they're able to leave. And I think, aside from Emery, the most annoying character award can go to his mother
Yes.
because, my goodness, that lady's yelling. I was like, okay, I understand why he has such a punchable face now.
Yeah, she was like, there, like I said, there's very few things I remember about this when it originally aired, and Emery and his mother were definitely two of the things I remember. Just her, love of stuffed animals, which, like, same, honestly, but just her screeching.
And you also have Professor Miller, who is pretty over the top as well. The thing about these TV miniseries is that they tend to be more over the top than they need to be. And I think maybe that's just because of the time periods, but it seems like any Stephen King adaptation now is taken a bit more seriously, especially within the TV format when you have something like The Outsider. I can't imagine 10 years from now The Outsider is going to look as ridiculous as some of the things in Rose Red did now, with as far as how the characters are acting. And for a very long time, horror was not taken as a serious genre.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that has to do with a lot of the reasons why so many of these adaptations end up being pretty campy. And it's not that I'm against that. Obviously, I am watching all of them, literally all of them that I can find, except for the other 7 Children of the Corn movies right now. But you get a sense that they picked a cast that would play these specific roles to a T. And, you have someone like Judith Ivey playing Kathy, and she seems much more reserved than anyone else in this. And I think that's why she's able to be that person at the end who sort of steps up and helps them get out of there, because she's not freaking out like Emery. She's not acting like Professor Miller and running around and chasing after this crazy mom who is screaming for her son. And unfortunately, David Dukes, who plays Professor Miller, actually died while they were shooting this.
Yeah, and I saw at the end they dedicated it to him.
Yeah.
And then in the documentary, they sort of talked about that too. I can't imagine, because at that point, they're all like a family.
Yeah.
So the thing that's interesting to me about Kathy is that, he writes a lot of characters who are, she's kind of like archetyped as like the religious older lady. And I feel like in a lot of his works, that's the person who does a lot of damage, like we see that in Carrie and things like that. But in this one, she really is kind of like the savior. She comes to everybody, everyone's aid at the end. And you're right, throughout it, even though there's, she comes face to face with just as much, when she's like wandering the halls with Nick before he gets taken. But she's just very level-headed about most of it, which I'm not sure why he went kind of like the opposite way that he normally does in with that kind of character, but it was sort of refreshing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, do you have anything else you want to discuss about the story in particular? I know we kind of lean mostly negative towards this, but again, I did like a lot of the aspects of it. So if you don't have anything else, though, we can sort of jump into ratings and some final thoughts here.
I don't have anything to add except for same with you. I know we said it was sort of kind of a flimsy story, but overall, I really like it.
Yeah, ultimately, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5, which isn't great, isn't horrible, but it was fine. It was better than I expected it to be. And sometimes I can forgive certain plot holes because I have a little more knowledge about how much it takes to get something like this made. And when you read about sort of the pre-production issues that it had, the fact that we even got it at all, it's like, okay, it was an ABC miniseries. You have limits to what you can do on those big network stations. And that's the thing now, like I mentioned, The Outsider, that's on HBO. So you can go in many different directions when you don't have as many restrictions on what you can show on TV.
Yeah, especially like the difference between like what ABC shows and HBO. HBO, you can pretty much do anything you want.
Yeah.
So for sure, I agree with you.
So are you in the 3 out of 5 range too? What's your rating for this?
I think 3 out of 5 is a pretty fair rating. I like it a lot more as just a Stephen King movie. I would say 3 out of 5. I think I have sort of, pun intended, rose-colored glasses when it comes to it, just because of like the history I personally have with it that I don't have with a lot of King things that are my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I think the fact that, you mentioned this earlier, the time period that it came out, I think movies like horror movies in that like 2000s a lot of times do get a really bad rap just for being goofy or whatever. So I think the fact that you as someone in 2020 can watch it and say like it was better than I expected, I think gives it a lot of merit. I think 3 out of 5 is pretty fair.
Yeah, it's just one you don't hear a lot about. And I think that is partially because it's so hard to find now. It's obvious that a lot of people watched it on ABC. I don't think ABC would have committed to this thinking it was going to totally bomb. I mean, you look at things like I mentioned earlier, Golden Years, or even The Langoliers, and it's like, okay, enough people watch those and those are readily available on DVD, but this one is so much harder to find. And sometimes that can be because of the production companies. And I know there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but I really think this one deserves the Blu-ray treatment at this point because it's so hard to find on DVD. And I do think there are some good things about it that a lot of Stephen King fans would appreciate if they didn't have the chance to see it in 2002. I believe I would have been like 9 when this came out, so it wasn't even close to being on my radar.
Right. Yeah, I tried to look up sort of why that happens. But it's kind of weird to me that they like aired it on TV, then they released the DVD like the same year, and then that was sort of it. And I luckily have a copy of the DVD.
Nice.
One of my co-hosts gave it to me for Christmas, actually, like really recently. So the fact that I was able to watch it again, I just was like, oh, so excited. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully it'll start. I feel like movies from that era and miniseries from that era are sort of making their rounds now. Because I know I actually they did a prequel like miniseries to it a couple years after that.
That one's easier to find. You can like rent that on Amazon.
Yeah, I just saw that today. I ordered the DVD because of course I have to have it. But I was like, why this one? Because I didn't even know, like, even being a fan of Rose Red, I did not even know that miniseries existed until today. Like, I knew about the book, because
Okay.
I did read it, whenever it came out, but I had no idea. And I'm like, why is this one the one that you can just go rent?
It
So
makes
I don't know.
absolutely no sense to me. And I have to watch Firestarter 2 coming up
Oh,
soon. And there's a DVD for like $10, but I was like, why can I not just rent this digitally? Why is it not on digital anywhere?
I don't know. And, we always, for my podcast, try and do free things that are streaming for free, or it's
Yeah.
things that are on YouTube just for access so everybody can watch it. And whenever we start lining up movies to do for like our Stephen King month, it's so hard to find a lot of this stuff streaming, or some of it even to buy. And I just like don't understand why. And especially now I feel like, he's always been, obviously he's very prolific, but I feel like right now there's sort of even more of a resurgence just because of the It remake, chapter 1 and 2 doing so well, and Outsider, people are really kind of like getting back into him, where
Yeah, and Doctor Sleep, the Pet Cemetery remake, which I know is a little more controversial than the rest of those. But
yeah, so I feel like I just hopefully all of that stuff, oh, and they're just, like his new book that came out this year is already optioned. So hopefully we'll start seeing more, like he could have his own streaming service at this point. Like let's somebody get on that. But yeah, I don't know.
I feel like Shudder should just have all of the Stephen King stuff. I know at one point they did have like a little Stephen King section, but it went away. And I really think, Shudder just needs to find a way to digitize all of these random, B or C list Stephen King adaptations.
Yeah, I agree with you because it is, it's hard to get a hold of everything. And my other problem is like I have a few of the collections that they've put out, and it's a lot of times it's like the same like one or two movies in the collection that are in another one, and I'm like, well, I have to buy this because it's the only way to get these other three movies. So it's just crazy. But I think Rose Red would be worth. They could just release all of it together in a package, but I don't know.
They should just do like a set with the Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, Rose Red, and then that diary book you mentioned, and that would be like a really cool package thing that Stephen King fans could get.
Yeah, I love that idea. I really want it now.
All right. Well, I hope somebody important enough is listening to this and can attempt to make that happen.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Well, Katie, thank you so much. Is there anything you want to plug real quick before we go here?
Um, I mean, obviously, I've mentioned the podcast. I Hope You Suffer. We are just about to hit 100 episodes, so we are really excited about that. And you can find us on any streaming thing. Obviously, it's just I Hope You Suffer. And I guess myself, I'm an artist. I do a lot of like horror related art and also video game that also tends to be horror related on my Instagram, which is just werewolf face, like the animal werewolf and then face. So you can follow me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on to talk about Rose Red today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.